Dante Alighieri, scholar, visionary, prophet, poet. In fact, that last title, poet, was the honorable title he wished for most. In a fascinating moment late in Paradiso, when the pilgrim is close to the vision of God, the poet says, "Should it ever come to pass that this sacred poem, to which both heaven and earth have set their hand, so that it has made me lean for many years, should overcome the cruelty that locks me out of the fair sheepfold where I slept as a lamb, with another voice then, with another fleece, shall I return a poet and take the laurel crown." His heart's desire then, in addition to being welcomed home to Florence, was to be proclaimed poeta, or poet. As so often in reading Dante, we find ourselves confused or unable to understand exactly why Dante would take some idea so seriously. Dante, as we know, spent the entirety of his life writing poetry, reading poetry, talking about poetry, and practicing to get better at his poetry. Before the comedy, the young Dante had written the Vita Nuova, a commentary on his own poetry. He would later write an encyclopedic vernacular treatise for his contemporaries, which was also written as a commentary on his own poetry. And after that, he wrote a third book called On Vernacular Eloquence, in which he tried to think down to the roots, principles of what made good poetry. As I have said, we find this a little perplexing. Why would anyone as sincere as old Dante spend so much of his life thinking about something we, in comparison, value so little? I mean, sure, we ask our kids to memorize little poems, don't we, to help them with their memory work. But chances are, unless you live in Greenwich Village or Soho or teach a creative writing class at Harvard, you don't read poetry, do you? But the truth is, Dante would find us as strange as we find him. He wouldn't be able to understand that we couldn't understand him. I would say that in this respect, it's our age which is a bit out of step with history. As you know, men like Tolkien and Lewis spent most of their lives trying to figure out the purpose and meaning of poetry. And before then, John Henry Newman said that his whole goal in life was to do for theology what the Romantic poet Wordsworth had done for literature. In that same era, the great Jesuit poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, thought that by writing his wildly experimental poems, he was creating a power of looking into the world beneath its surface. Poetry, he said, is speech framed for contemplation of the mind. And before Hopkins, the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge said this, "Poetry, even that of the loftiest and seemingly that of the wildest odes, has a logic of its own, as severe as that of science." For this reason, it's valuable to spend time with someone like Dante, isn't it? Someone who is as strange to us as we would be to him. As we turn back to the comedy, we note that in almost every canto in the 20s, we find some reflection on poetry or language. Indeed, this is the part of the comedy where Dante thinks hardest about his own poetry and its purpose. With that said, we can divide up Dante's observation on poetry into two clusters. In Canti 21, 22, and 25, we find that the poet is reflecting on the salvation of the Roman poet Statius, and thus by extension, Dante's relationship to ancient poetry. The second reflection begins in Canto 26 and pertains to Dante's relationship to contemporary vernacular poets, including his own father figure, Guido Guinizelli. And finally, we'll see how Dante, having framed his relationship to the best of the ancient world and the best of the contemporary world, puts that poetry to use when he enters into the garden at the top of Mount Purgatory. In the last lecture, we talked about the terraces of avarice and gluttony, and specifically how God rewrites the souls of purgatory through their sacred reading. But in the midst of those canti, there was a subplot which we did not discuss and which I want to take up today: the salvation of the Roman poet Statius. Statius was born in France, wrote in Latin, and lived a century after Virgil. He wrote an epic poem about the mythological war over Thebes, which played out sometime after Oedipus died. It was thus natural that he borrowed heavily from the greatest Roman poet in the previous generation. It's interesting and rather beautiful to note that when his character bumps into Virgil in the Pilgrim in Purgatorio and is asked who he is, he mentioned Virgil's name, as if his identity is unthinkable except in relationship to his hero and source of inspiration. His own identity cannot be separated from Virgil, even though he had never known him personally. But even across this gulf of time, Statius can hold this reverence for his hero. So sweet was my poetic recitation. Rome drew me from Toulouse and deemed me worthy to have my brows adorned with myrtle. Statius is my name. On earth men often say it. The spark that kindled the fire in me came from the holy flame from which more than 1,000 have been lit. I mean the Aeneid. When I wrote my poems, it was my mama and my nurse. Without it, I would not have weighed a dram. To have lived on earth when Virgil lived, I would have stayed 1 year longer than I owed before I came forth from my exile. Statius then learned his own greatness by imitating the greatness of Virgil. He learned the subtleties of his art by apprenticing himself to a master of old. And as he will also reveal, as he learned this art, he also learned virtue. In other words, Statius had a habit of reading and reading closely, which the American philosopher Alan Bloom, in his 1987 The Closing of the American Mind, worried was evaporating within American culture. I want to quote a bit from that book by way of helping us appreciate how much Dante values this reverent reading of the classics of the past. In contrast to Statius, then, Bloom laments that, quote, our students have lost the practice of and the taste for reading. They have not learned how to read, nor do they have the expectation of delight or improvement from reading. When I first noticed the decline in reading during the late 60s, I began asking my large introductory classes and any other group of younger students to which I spoke, what books really count for them. Most are silent, puzzled by the question. The notion of books as companions is foreign to them. Justice Black, with his tattered copy of the Constitution in his pocket at all times, is not an example that would mean much to them. There is no printed word to which they look for counsel, inspiration, or joy. Bloom then continues, suggesting that these reading habits have left our imaginations unfurnished with examples of heroism, or even with real concrete sense of evil. Bloom says, having heard over a period of years the same kind of responses to my question about favorite books, I began to ask students who their heroes are. Again, there is usually silence, and most frequently nothing follows. And finally, Bloom adds, following on what I learned from this second question, I began asking a third, who do you think is evil? To this one, there's an immediate response, Hitler. Stalin is hardly mentioned. After him, who else? And there it stops. They have no idea of evil. They doubt its existence. Hitler is just another abstraction, an item to fill up an empty category. Thus, the most common student view lacks an awareness of the depths as well as the heights, and hence lacks gravity. End quote. In sharp contrast to Bloom's anxious description of our unfurnished imaginations is Dante, of course. And his Statius exemplifies for Dante that reverent fidelity to the past. When he realizes it's Virgil standing in front of him, his hero, he blushes, as it were, and immediately bows, and thus through this spontaneous act manifests his deep-seated admiration. After Statius has mentioned his admiration for Virgil, the pilgrim has the delightful opportunity to tell Statius that his guide is the ancient Roman poet. The pilgrim tells Statius, this one who guides my eyes on high is the very Virgil from whom you took the power to sing of men and of the gods. Already Statius was stooping to embrace my teacher's feet, but Virgil said, brother, do not do so. For you are a shade, and you behold a shade. And the other rising, now you understand the measure of the love for you that warms me. As the conversation between Statius and Virgil continues to unfold in the next canto, Canto 22, Dante has Statius confess even more. Virgil was not only responsible for Statius becoming a craftsman of the Latin language, but Virgil, pagan Virgil, was also responsible for pagan Statius becoming a Christian. In their exchange, Virgil says to Statius that there's no indication in the latter's poetry that he was a Christian. Indeed, as far as modern scholars know, there shouldn't be any. Statius never became a Christian. But Dante takes advantage of the silence of history to fill in a backstory of his own devising. Dante has Statius say that he had indeed become a Christian, but he hid it. He was a closet Christian. But the biggest surprise comes when Statius attributes his Christian salvation to the elder Roman poet Virgil. He says, "It was you who first set me towards Parnassus to drink in its grottos, and you who first lit my way toward God. You were as one who goes by night, carrying the light behind him. It's no help to him, but instructs all those who follow. When you said, 'The centuries turn new again, justice returns with the first age of man, and new progeny descends from heaven,' through you I was a poet, through you a Christian. The words of yours I have just recited did so accord with the new preachers that I began to visit them." Virgil, then, was a man who carried a lantern behind his back. It lighted the path for those behind him, although it was no use for him. The poem that Statius quotes is the so-called Fourth Eclogue, a lyrical pastoral poem which Virgil wrote. Virgil wrote it as an expression of hope that peace would soon return to his war-torn Italy. But the imagery he used to express his desire was so close to Scripture that medieval readers accepted it as a prophetic announcement of the imminent advent of Christ. Virgil wrote, "Now the last age by Cumae's Sibyl sung has come and gone, and the majestic roll of circling centuries begins anew. Justice returns old Saturn's reign. The iron shall cease, the golden race arise. Whatso tracks remain of our old wickedness, once done away, shall free the earth from never-ceasing fear. For thee, O boy, first shall the earth untilled pour freely forth her childish gifts. The serpent too shall die shall the treacherous poison plant." The pagan poem, written several decades before Christ, almost sounds like a Christmas hymn. And in that poem, Virgil goes on to say that there will be no more tilling of the soil, because all plants will spring up in every land. There will be no more avaricious merchants, because we will all have what we need. All our crimes will be wiped away, and the peaceful golden age will return when that mysterious boy comes to rule the world. Later in the comedy, Dante has the young woman in the Garden of Eden, Matilda, tell the three travelers that such pagan poetic dreaming of the golden age wasn't mere fancy, but was rather a groping attempt to recollect the bliss which man enjoyed in his infancy. She says, "Those who in ancient times called up in verse the age of gold and sang its happy state dreamed of Parnassus, or perhaps this very place. Here the root of humankind was innocent. Here it is always spring, with every fruit in season. This is the nectar which the ancients tell." I turned around and then to my poets and saw that they had listened to her final utterance with a smile. This then is the extraordinary compliment that Dante pays poetry through Statius's praise of Virgil. Poetry is not an escape from reality. It is the intensification of it. It's the attempt to remember man's origin, or as Tolkien put it, good poetry brings with it a curious thrill, as if something stirs in you, half wakened from sleep. He says, there's something remote and strange and beautiful behind the words, something which derives its curiously moving quality from some older world. So much for the ancient poets. What's important to note is that Dante wants us to see that he's the diligent student of these great ancient poets, even if separated by centuries. The poet makes us see this through the narrative details. The two Roman poets went along in front, and I, alone, came on behind, listening to their discourse, which gave me understanding of the art of verse. For Dante, then, this ancient poetry represents the attempt to put in words the highest ambitions of human beings. It is the pursuit of the best possible language to frame those dreams and hopes, and thus involves a lifetime of slow and quiet study of the greatest books by the greatest masters. For Dante, this means copying them word by word with quiet and patient attentiveness, ready to find what secrets undergird their art. And it is this habit of study which Dante represents himself as following when he has his pilgrim listening with carefully attuned ears to the private conversations of the two Roman masters about the secrets of their craft. This brings us to Canto 25 of Purgatorio, which, I'm sorry to say, probably qualifies as one of the top 3 most boring canti in all of the comedy. There, the pilgrim asks a fairly simple question, but then gets a lot more than he bargained for by way of an answer. After passing through the terrace of the gluttonous, the pilgrim wonders, how is it that the shades, who do not have earthly bodies, can be made to grow thin through the hunger which is produced from the sweet-smelling trees? Virgil allows Statius to answer this one, and Statius launches into a very long description of the medieval biological theory of reproduction. A special purified blood is made in the heart, and this ultra-rarefied blood becomes the seed, which when transmitted into the appropriate vessel, carries with it the active vital part, which crafts the matter provided by the female into the appropriate form for the human body. But at a certain point, Statius continues, God has this life force, this power of forming human organs and systems, merge with a higher soul, that which reasons, reflects on itself, and uses language. Upon death, Statius concludes, this soul, this talking, thinking, and speaking soul, is separated from matter and is sent to either hell or purgatory, where it shapes the air around it, just as it once shaped the bodily matter which had surrounded it on earth. Okay, well, what's the point of Canto 25? It was surely more interesting to Dante's readers than it is to us. It was a kind of Discovery Channel moment in which the biological secrets of reproduction were revealed. But other ages' cast-off science only seems strange and naive to later generations. Perhaps, like our scientific preoccupations, one day will in later times. But if we stick with the text of Dante, though, we can find more. We have to remember that the context of this canto, that is, it falls right between Canto 24, which talks about Statius's debt to Virgil, and Canto 26, which describes Dante's own poetic debt to a poet of an earlier generation, Guido Guinizelli. Canto 25, then, is nestled in the midst, as we have said, of canti, each of which has something to say about poetry or language and generation. Thus, in addition to the Discovery Channel discussion of where babies come from, I think Dante's trying to show us that when you pare everything back, when you try to seek out raw humanity, you have to understand that man is not just a rational animal, but you could say man is a language-using animal, or better, a sign-using animal, which from the very beginning of its creation uses gestures, expressions, and words to incarnate desires and the ideas of its heart. Take a look at Canto 25, verse 91 and following. Statius explains how the vital power of the soul informs the air around it into the airy bodies which suffer and speak in the afterlife. And as the air, when it's full of rain, is adorned with rainbow hues not of its making, but reflecting the brightness of another, so here the neighboring air is shaped into that form the soul which stays with it imprints upon it by its powers. A shade, we call it, since the insubstantial soul is visible this way, which from the same air forms organs for each sense, even that of sight. Through this we speak, and through this smile. Thus we shed tears and make the sighs you may have heard here on the mountain. Thus, in Dante's formulation, the ability to speak and receive communicative sensations is so essential to the nature of the human that the soul immediately shapes that air around it to form a bodily medium through which it can communicate. It's so essential that the soul cannot be without it even for a moment. You could say then that the human being for Dante is a poetry-using animal, a creature with the constant desire to express on the outside that which it experiences within. After Statius's lengthy speech, Dante moves on to Purgatorio 26, where we read about how the pilgrim climbs up onto the final terrace, where the lustful, both heterosexual and homosexual, stand in flames. This is the only time that we see souls enduring that traditional punishment of fire, which the popular imagination associates with the afterlife. It's employed here, of course, because it's an externalization of that inner fire which the lustful allowed to burn out of control in life. Now, though, the people who in life let their inner passions burn freely and without control have to practice at remaining precisely within the boundaries of the flame. When these souls do see the pilgrim, they, more than any other group of souls, are surprised and delighted to see that he's still in his body. Perhaps not surprisingly, they're particularly attuned to notice bodily appearances. And then somewhat humorously, the poet says, "Then some of them came up as near me as they could, always careful not to venture beyond the burning of the flame." We further learn that the souls in the terrace of the lustful form two lines, depending on the nature of their sins in life. These two lines file past one another, moving in opposite directions. One file shouts, "Sodom and Gomorrah," while the other file recalls how mythological Queen Pasiphae, who rather repulsively fell in love with a bull and had a wooden cow built so that she could mate with it. The spokesman for the lustful, Guido Guinizelli, explains to the pilgrim that this meditation helps the lustful recall the repulsiveness of their sin. And I think the jarring, disturbing nature of the image of Queen Pasiphae is particularly important for this terrace, given that lust, as anyone knows who watches romantic comedies, is the most forgivable of all sins in a way, isn't it? You find yourself cheering for the fornicators. Here Guido explains, "Because we did not follow human law, but ran behind our appetites like beasts, we shout Pasiphae's name, who made herself a beast." The souls are made then to re-envision the sin which they thought in life was sophisticated and charming. But at the same time, the lustful also meditate on exemplars of chastity. They sing the hymn Summe Deus Clementiae, a beautiful hymn to a God of great mercy, probably because in the third stanza the prayer goes, "Our hearts in pity heal with thy chastening fire. Gird thou our loins, each passion quell, and every harmful lust expel." They also recall what Mary said to the angel during the Annunciation, "Virum non cognosco," I know not man. And then they continue to sing about chaste wives and husbands and matrimony. But as we have said, woven in and out of all these canti is a meditation on the nature of language and poetry. So here too, the pilgrim meets and talks to more poets, this time not the venerable, time-respected poets of antiquity, but the passionate, fashionable love poets who wrote recently and in the vernacular. One poet wrote in Provençal, a language related to French, which was once spoken in Provence. In fact, Arnaud Daniel is actually allowed to speak in that language at the end of the canto. The other poet, who has a larger role in this canto, had written in Italian the century before Dante. His name is Guido Guinizelli. In fact, it's Guinizelli who was mentioned in Canto 24 by Buonaggiunta as that poet who started the sweet new style, which was based on praise of love and philosophical reflection on beauty. In his most famous poem, for example, Guinizelli meditates on the nature of love and beauty and says that true nobility is like a flame in which love is the heat. The two just go together. But Guinizelli finishes his poem in a bold way, suggesting that he would rather be a lover than a supporter of dry theological doctrine. Here's what he says. Lady, God will say to me when my soul stands before him, how could you presume? You went past heaven, coming finally to me, and tried to compare me to a vain love. All praises are due to me alone, and to the queen of this noble realm, through whom all evil ends. But I shall say to him, she had the likeness of an angel from your kingdom. It's not my fault if I fell in love with her. It's a bold statement by the poet that he preferred earthly and tangible beauty to abstract ideas in a far-off place. Not surprisingly, now, in this terrace, poets such as Guinizelli and Arnaud Daniel have to be purged of that preference for earthly love to heavenly love. As Arnaud Daniel says at the end of the canto, I am Arnaud, weeping and singing as I make my way. I see with grief past follies, and I see, rejoicing, the joy I hope is coming. They must learn, in other words, to relocate their bliss. But interestingly, that earthly love which landed them here in these fires also seems to have been the secret for the success of their poetry. And perhaps to our surprise, Dante reenacts in this canto the same reverence for a father figure that Statius had shown for Virgil a few canti earlier. When the pilgrim hears that it is Guinizelli who stands before him, then he's astounded, standing speechless before his hero for several moments. I knew he had been father to me and to others my betters, who always used love's sweet and graceful rhymes. For a long time deep in thought, without listening or speaking, I gazed at him. He answered, tell me what has caused you to disclose by speech and look that you still hold me dear. And I to him, your sweet verses, which as long as modern custom lasts, will make their very ink seem precious. But it's interesting to note that then Guinizelli, unlike Virgil, deflects this praise, pointing out that for vernacular writers, because the language changes so fast, there will always be a chain of writers who succeed one another. I suppose you could say it's the difference between rock stars and classic novelists. 50 years from now, people will still be reading Tolstoy and Dickens, but the rock stars who win Grammys will be completely different. And the stuff we think is cool today will seem dated then. Indeed, I think this meditation on how quickly fads fade lies behind Dante's delightful simile in the middle of this canto. Dante says that when the lustful souls first saw him, they gawked at him as if he were a country bumpkin, as if they were country bumpkins. Not less astounded is the mountaineer, struck dumb and staring all around him, when rough and rustic he comes into a town, then each shade seemed from its expression. Indeed, in Dante's day, the game of love was a sophisticated one, involving nice clothes, expendable income, elegant parties, and so forth. You can imagine how poorly suited the cowboy from eastern Oklahoma would be in the middle of Manhattan in a Sex and the City episode. But this is exactly how Dante chooses to describe those ultra-sophisticated lovers, the slick big city folk of his day. And so these vernacular writers, hot and passionate and in fashion in their day, seem hopelessly out of date and even awkward when they encounter a lover of a different sort. Dante is, of course, the author of love poetry. But in this journey, love serves as the engine of a larger enterprise in pursuit of God, virtue, and cleanness of heart. The fashionable set of lovers in this terrace, then, are stupefied when they see a use of love beyond their myopic conceptions. This, then, is Dante's way of constructing the roots of his own poetry. On the one hand, he, the modern poet, has a reverence for the past. He eavesdrops on the conversation of Statius and Virgil and learns the secrets of the classic craft. But at the same time, he wants to have something of the passion, the fire, and the urgency of the modern. The classic craft is not enough. Rather, he needs to draw on the resources of the love poet as well, who spent his whole life trying to give external form to his interior experience. Dante's really trying to do the impossible, to have the power and reserve and depth and thoughtfulness of the classic and ancient, while having the inspiration, timeliness, urgency, and vitality of the contemporary. In the next two canti, we have a great scene. We hear that there is just one ordeal left, a wall of fire, which the three will have to walk through. It's interesting to note that Virgil and Statius won't feel any pain at all when walking through these flames. But as we might expect, this is the moment that Dante, the man who spent most of his life writing hot love poems, was really not looking forward to. The angel calls to Dante, "Blessed are they who are clean in heart," and then says, "There is no going on, you blessed souls, without the fire's stinging bite. Enter, and do not stop your ears against the distant song." But when the pilgrim hears this, he freezes. Hearing him, I felt like a man who has been put into his grave. Dante won't budge. He's not about to move into the fire. Virgil tries to comfort him with all of those blandishments a parent or teacher uses. He tells him that this bitter medicine will be good for him. Sure, it might be painful, but it won't last too long, and in the long run, he won't be harmed. But all these words are without any motivational power. Then Virgil tries one last argument. When he saw me stay, unmoved and obstinate, he said, somewhat disturbed, "Now look, my son, this wall stands between Beatrice and you." That's what was needed. At the name of Beatrice, Dante plunges into the fire, which is hot beyond belief. As soon as I was in, I would have thrown myself straight into molten glass to cool myself. So beyond measure was the burning there. And my sweet father, to comfort me, kept speaking of Beatrice as he went, saying, "Even now I can almost see her eyes." When we get to the other side of the wall of flames, then we note that this was the pilgrim's final test. And in Purgatorio 27, the pilgrim enjoys a bit of an awards ceremony with his guide. On the borders of Eden, Virgil declares the pilgrim whole and healthy and morally restored. "I have brought you here with intellect and skill. From now on, take your pleasure as your guide. You are free of the steep way, free of the narrow. Look at the sun shining before you. Look at the fresh grass, flowers, and trees which here the earth produces of itself. You may sit down or move among these until the fair eyes come rejoicing, which weeping bade me come to you. No longer wait for word or sign from me. Your will is free, upright, and sound. Not to act as it chooses is unworthy. Over yourself I crown and mitre you." Dante, then, is both his own bishop and his own king. He doesn't need law to regulate him or rules to follow. He is now free. Ordinarily, if you think about it, the advice to follow the desire of your heart is terrible, isn't it? But here, all Dante has now to do is consult his desire to do what he wants, because he has now entered back into that original state of justice. And it's with this moral constitution that Dante portrays himself as re-entering the original home of man, representing this great homecoming into that place for which man was originally made. Thus, the 28th canto of Purgatorio is a momentous one, whose dramatic action has long been anticipated. It's the apex of the mountain of purgatory, and has been the goal of the pilgrim's journey throughout the canticle. This moment, then, is psychologically charged with those emotions of relief, joy, and surprise, which usually attend a homecoming, but intensified, given the fact that the pilgrim represents all of humanity. Dante, poet, then needs a special poetic power to capture the joyful and long-awaited event. Purgatorio 28, then, is a kind of poetic manifesto, an instantiation of what the truly Christian disciple of Virgil can accomplish. A demonstration of how the Christian poet, armed with the vernacular literary love tradition, can surpass antiquity. You'll remember that at the end of Purgatorio 28, when the mysterious woman the pilgrim meets tells Dante that this is the same place the ancient poets had dreamed of when they sang of the Golden Age. By pointing out such a fact, Dante ensures that we don't miss the point. What the pagans had groped to speak of, Dante sees with his own eyes. What they had longed for, Dante experiences in the flesh. We have to mention, too, that according to medieval theory, Eden was particularly associated with language. Eden was the place wherein language was born and fitted perfectly to the reality it was meant to signify, before the rift emerged between words and things. Eden, of course, is where Adam, the so-called nomothete, or name-giver, was inspired to use words, like the original poet, to name creation around him. In a certain sense, then, Adam was the father of poetry, given that he was the ultimate God-inspired practitioner of language. All subsequent language could be measured against Adam's first God-inspired use of it. With so much anticipation, then, it's exciting to see how Dante actually does represent his brief sojourn in the garden into this linguistically charged locale. In the first part of Purgatorio 28, the poet depicts not so much the layout and nature of the garden, but his experience of it. Indeed, from the opening lines of this canto, the details of the garden are framed within reference to the pilgrim's movement and desire. Eager already to search within and about the divine forest, thick and alive, which tempered the new day to my eyes, without further waiting, I left the bank. Whatever we know of the garden is filtered through the pilgrim's subjective response to it. We learn of the sweet breeze, but only as it strikes the brow of the pilgrim. We hear of the river because it bars the pilgrim's progress. The whole scene has almost a cinematic quality, filmed, as it were, from a first-person angle, so that what is described always has the feel of being viewed through the pilgrim's eyes. Indeed, the mysterious lady's first words, "You three are new here," with their use of plural forms, as one scholar says, may well cause momentary astonishment. Suddenly we become aware again of Virgil and Statius, who all the while must have been standing loyally nearby. Dante has caught us into his own passionate absorption. We have forgotten the two poets as completely as he forgets them. But in addition to this powerful first-person view of the garden, the poet also somewhat surprisingly adopts poetic techniques from the vernacular, secular traditions to describe the this-worldly delights of his Eden. For example, he draws upon a genre of poetry known as the pastoral, in which knight meets peasant shepherdess and tries to seduce her. Echoes of this lyrical tradition crop up in Dante's meeting with Matilda in the sacred forest, when the poet compares himself to the classical lover Leander. Famously, one scholar, Charles Singleton, asked, "But was Leander's not a most sensual love? And is not the comparison saying that Dante hates the separating waters, and but for them would be with Matilda as her lover, if he could? But how can such love, how can any such desire be now in Dante? It was but yesterday that he passed through the fire that burns all carnal lust away." Well, the fact is, believe it or not, Dante seems simply to be following in the footsteps of such orthodox Christian theologians as Augustine and Aquinas, by depicting the garden as a place of magnitudo delectationis, of intense delight. Well, let's try to put all this together as we move toward the conclusion of this lecture. We've seen that toward the end of Purgatorio, Dante not only shows that the pilgrim has reached his full potential as a human being, returning to the original state of justice, earning his moral freedom, but he also has returned to, we could say, an original state of language. The poet maps out the genealogy of his poetry in the canti, which immediately precede the earthly paradise, and he traces two lines of descent. On the one hand, there's the ancient poetry of Virgil and Statius, those poets who cultivated a long view of history, including man's beginning, as well as his epic struggle to return to that spiritual landscape of his origin in the Golden Age. As we saw, this was the poetry of learning, but also of virtue, piety, discipline, study, and imitation. But there's also the vernacular poetry, which cultivated the intense, the personal, the immediate, and the present, in direct contrast to the long view of history. Its power lay in its ability to bracket off all else but the immediate first-person experience of overwhelming love. The genius of Dante's poetry, then, is that it maps these two traditions on top of one another. uncovering the radical joy which man now recalls only as a half-remembered dream. But Dante uses the intensity of the first-person view of lyrical poetry so that goodness, justice, and joy don't come across to us as they usually do, as dull, but rather strike us as spiritually radioactive. In this way, Dante fulfills, as it were, the ancient dream expressed in writing about the Golden Age. He rewrites Virgil through Guinizelli, and in doing so, he makes us nostalgic for the original state of purity and justice.